from the snowy Copenhagen. Welcome to the webinar Business Models in District Energy Systems, hosted by the Copenhagen Centre on Energy Efficiency. My name is Aris. I'm working as a program officer at the Copenhagen Centre, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. A couple of things before we move to the main content of our webinar. This webinar is going to be about 60 minutes long, including time for Q&A at the end. In case you cannot stay until the end or want to get back to our presentations, all the materials and the recording of the whole webinar will be available online in a few days on the Copenhagen Centre's knowledge management system. And we have many other webinars and information there. Have a look. I'll give you more information in a few minutes. Before we start discussing about today's webinar, I would like to inform our attendees that we comply with the General Data Protection Act, also known as GDPR. This means that your personal data, such as name, email, workplace, etc., is safely processed and stored, and all of your rights pursuant to the GDPR are respected. You have full access to the data being processed about you, and at any time you can request that inaccurate data be deleted or rectified. For access or further information, please contact with the people that are presented here. Now, a few things about the Copenhagen Centre. The Centre conducts research and advisory activities in the field of energy efficiency and serves as energy efficiency hub for the Sustainable Energy for All initiative. The Centre has an established network of global, regional, and national partners with a broad range of stakeholders to help accelerate the implementation of energy efficiency activities. On a regular basis, the Copenhagen Centre is conducting webinars. All materials, including recordings and presentations from previous webinars, can be found on Copenhagen Centre Knowledge Management System under the e-learning section. The material of today's webinar will be uploaded shortly, but until then, you can check one of the recommended webinars that are related to today's topic. Now, I would like to briefly introduce the speaker of today's webinar. We will start with Clara. Clara is working as postdoctoral researcher at the Copenhagen Centre on Energy Efficiency, specialized in the climate-conscious transformation of the building sector. And our next speaker will be Craig. Craig is the principal specialist for district energy at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. In this role, he works with district energy projects across the EBRD's area of activity. Finally, I would like to inform that you can send us your questions during the presentations using the dedicated icon, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can at the end. Please do not forget to mention the name of the panelist that the question is for. So, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Clara. Clara, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Aris. So, welcome everybody to the Business Models in District Energy Systems webinar. My name is Clara Camarasa, as my colleague already mentioned. And yeah, I'm very pleased to be guiding you in this first session of this webinar. So the overall objective of this webinar is to share insights of business models to ensure the viability of district energy projects for both heating and cooling systems. It is important to highlight that this webinar is part of the training modules offered by the District Energy in Cities initiative, which soon will be available in the C2E2 website KMS system that Aris already mentioned. So before I delve further into the content, I would like to start by sharing a brief overview of this program. The District Energy in Cities initiative is a public-private partnership co-hosted by the United Nations Environment Programme and UNEP-DTU partnership in Copenhagen, with the mission of helping cities tackle the energy transition through the use of district energy systems. The initiative supports local and national governments in the identification of pilot projects and the development of local and national strategies to accelerate the development of district energy systems and thereby create market transformation. It currently has over 60 partners, including private sector, research institutions, development banks, and public entities, with over 30 cities across 14 countries located all over the world. But what do we exactly do? We focus on four main aspects. We increase the knowledge of multiple benefits of the district energy through capacity building activities. We provide technical assistance to identify potential pilot projects, undertake all kinds of pre-feasibility, feasibility, and rapid assessment studies. We design business models, we support the tender process and develop long-term local district energy strategies. And we also support the upscaling efforts, mainly at two levels. First, at a local level, through the establishment of a local multi-stakeholder coordination unit, and on a national level by assisting in the development of national frameworks that support the project development. Last but not least, we help to unlock investments, first by supporting the identification of financial mechanisms, and secondly by supporting the project financial stability, mostly focusing on the pioneer projects in the new markets. But why is district energy important? Well, I think at this point we can all agree that the decarbonization of the energy sector is a key aspect in the fight against climate change. Currently, the building sector is responsible for nearly 30% of the global greenhouse gas emissions and 40% of the primary energy consumption. Heating, hot water, and cooling account for 60% of the global energy consumption in buildings and are mainly reliant on fossil fuels. Furthermore, if we continue with business as usual, forecasts show that cooling demand will grow by 625%, so by more than factor 6 by 2050, yeah, in some regions of Asia and Latin America. Under this assumption, it has been estimated that to meet 2050 climate targets, the emissions from buildings need to be reduced by around 75%. So clearly, urgent solutions are required that both reduce the demand, but also shift the sources of supply if we want to achieve our climate and energy ambitions. So let's have a very, very brief overview of the modern district energy for those of you who are not acquainted yet with the solution. District energy is the utilization of one or more community energy sources to provide energy services to multiple users. It can replace individual building-based furnaces, air conditioning units, boilers, and chillers with a district-scale energy system via hot water, steam, or chilled water, for instance. This energy is distributed by insulated underground pipelines from the source of the energy to several buildings. Energy is then extracted from the buildings where finally the return pipe bring the water back to the energy source to be heated or cooled again. It can provide heating and or cooling as well as power. District energy systems offer several techno-economic advantages, but first, the city level energy infrastructure becomes more efficient, utilizing heating and cooling that would otherwise be wasted, but is also capable of integrating renewable energy sources while reducing cities' coal and oil consumption, for instance, with all of this reducing overall cost for the supply of energy, heating and cooling. It can in fact reduce energy consumption for heating and cooling in buildings by 30 to 50%. So as mentioned earlier, we need urgent solutions that reduce demand and shift sources of supply if we're going to achieve our climate and energy ambitions. And I would like to now add that district energy surely enables both of these in a cost-effective and technically demonstrated manner. But benefits of district energy are not only related to improving energy efficiency and adopting renewables. A bundle of additional benefits are associated with the implementation of this solution. Many cities are reducing refrigerant emissions while also cutting off CO2 emissions and improving local jobs or providing local jobs. The district cooling network in Paris, for instance, provides cooling from high-efficiency electric chillers, free cooling from the Seine River, and geothermal, which has reduced refrigerant emissions by 90% and CO2 emissions by 50% if compared to decentralized cooling. District energy can also help reduce cost in the medium and long run, particularly in cooling. For instance, in the city of Gebrail in Malaysia, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, they've lowered its cooling cost by nearly 40%. It also increases energy efficiency and energy access while reducing grid stress and blackouts. In this way, for many cities around the world, district energy will be essential for reaching 100% renewable or carbon neutral targets while unlocking a bundle of ancillary economic, social, environmental, and technical benefits. Now, why are business models so important when developing district energy projects? Although shares of district energy systems are expanding and several national, local governments are setting policies and targets, to enable their adoption, there's still long-lasting barriers to greater large-scale deployment of the modern district energy. These barriers include lack of awareness, scars of local and institutional capacity, sometimes inadequacy of holistic planning policies or regulations, and also fragmented or absence of data or information needed to assess their viability. But beyond these barriers, it's oftentimes economic-related hurdles which hamper the necessary investments to develop, upgrade, or refurbish this technology, especially in developing countries. These barriers are typically related to high initial capital expenditure, or CapEx, long payback times, or demand uncertainty. Also, in countries or markets where district energy has not been proven, high rates on debt due to the potential risk, can also reduce the viability of these projects. In all of these cases, it is crucial to have a solid business model that can overcome all of these barriers. And including steady financial structures along with demonstration projects will be critical in order to attract and engage stakeholders such as investors, owners, operators, utilities, suppliers, and consumers, and local authorities. Also, to leverage a lower cost for finance as needed to ensure that investment. A robust business model will also cater a good functioning and operations of the project, which in turn ensures the project stability and longevity. So in a way, the statement of Gebrail also holds true for district energy, that a mediocre technology pursued with a great business model may be more valuable than a great technology exploited via a mediocre business model. Now, business models and ownership structures can vary significantly across district energy projects, depending on the specific circumstances and of the project, as well as framework conditions, including, for instance, the project finance that is available. But in very broad terms, they can be grouped in a continuum from public to private, starting with the fully public models. In this case, the public sector, in its role as a local authority or public utility, has full ownership of the system, which allows them to have a complete control of the project and makes it possible to deliver broader social objectives, such as environmental outcomes and the alleviation of fuel poverty, for instance, through tariff control. They're characterized by a high degree of control, potential high degree of coverage, and medium to low returns, but also a high public risk. Out of all the different ownership models the district energy systems have, this business model is the most common globally. Typically, they have developed either by a subsidiary of the local authority, such as a pre-existing or newly created public utility, or within a department of the local authority, where they have funded it using the authority's balance sheet. These fully public models are commonly used in both consolidated and refurbishment projects or cities, and in a way they reflect the city's desire or degree of control over the provision of the thermal and cooling energy. Successful cases of this model can be found, among other, in Oslo and Bergen in Norway. And now moving to the public-private partnerships or hybrid models. These are models in which public and private entities collaborate with each other to develop and exploit district energy systems. This can be public facilitation of private engagement for strategic reasons, such as engagement of the private expertise to enhance the cash flow, for instance. This model must have a rate of return that will be attractive for the private sector, but the public sector is still willing to invest in the project and retain some kind of control. These business models can include a public and private joint venture, where the investment is provided by both parties that are creating the district energy company, or where the public and private sector finance different assets in the district energy. So, for instance, the production of the heating, cooling versus the transmission or the distribution. Another type is the concession contract, where the public sector is involved in the design and development of the project, and which is then developed, financed, and operated by the public sector, and the city usually has the option to buy back again the project in the future if they would be interested. Another type is the community-owned, not-for-profit or cooperative business model, where the municipality can establish an energy system as a community-owned kind of not-for-profit entity. And in this model, the local authority takes a lot of risk initially if it underwrites any financial project. This type of model is characterized by a medium degree of control, a coverage based on negotiation mostly, medium to high returns, and immediate public risk. An example of this model can be found in Thane, India, or in Paris, or even in the project that Greg will describe later on in Banja Luka. And the final or the last type of model is a privately owned model, and these are typically strategic partnerships with public facilitation. This business model is pursued where there's a high return for the private sector and requires limited public sector support. They're developed as a wholly private-owned special purpose vehicle that might benefit from guaranteed demand from the public sector or subsidy or some kind of local incentive. It is important to note that even in the cases where the private participation is the highest, the public authorities will still have a role in ensuring that the social and environmental objectives are attained. So these are characterized by a low degree of control, high returns, medium to low public risk, and an example of this could be the Port Louis in Mauritius or the Abdali project that will be presented in the upcoming session of this webinar. It is important to note also that the relative involvement of the public or private sector depends broadly in two main factors. First, the return on investment of the project for the investor, and to the degree of control and risk desired from the public sector. As mentioned earlier, I would like to stress, no matter what the model adopted is, public authorities hold a critical role in ensuring that the social and environmental requirements of the project and of the technology are met through public tendering and related regulated mechanisms. So on this note, I finalize my part of the presentation. I thank you all for your attention, and I leave the floor to the next panelist, Greg, for more information on the Global District Energy in Cities Initiative or the Copenhagen Centre on Energy Efficiency. Please visit the website that I share here in this slide or contact me in the email I share below. Thank you once again, and Greg, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're dialing in from. Thank you very much to both Aris and Clara for the introduction, and Clara for your presentation. And thanks as well to everyone with an interest in this topic. Thanks for taking the time to join the webinar today. I'm hoping for some good questions. So as mentioned, I am the District Energy Specialist at the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. I quite like to tell people that I'm not a banker, I'm actually an engineer. So I work on the technical and policy aspects of these projects, but I've been around my financially oriented colleagues long enough to pick up a thing or two. So I'm going to tell you today about how the EBRD finances some example projects and some more overall principles, covering business models, regulatory frameworks, the role of the private sector, and I'll share some case studies. And this is the idea is to show more general principles in the wider sector. I'd also like to say that this is another example of the great cooperation that the EBRD has had with the UN Environment and the UNEP DTU partnership. So long may it continue. And I also know that a number of participants today are from Chile, and Clara provided me with some information on the areas that you would like to see covered. So I've tried my best to incorporate this into the main presentation, but please don't be shy. In case I haven't covered something you would like to know more about, please raise it in the questions. So first off, an introduction to who the EBRD is, because we're certainly not a household name. We're what's known as an international financial institution or a development bank. And that means that we have no private shareholders, but we have a specific mission. So similar types of institutions in the world that you may be familiar with, the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank, or other such institutions. So this also colors the perspective from which I'm presenting. So a bit more about us. We're owned by 69 governments, and we have a bit of a unique mission. We were established in 1991 to aid the former Warsaw Pact countries and the former Soviet Union as they transition from planned economies to well-functioning market economies. And flash forward to today, we work in 39 countries, and our focus has expanded and we also work in some warmer and sunnier climates, such as the Middle East and North Africa. So in 2019, we lent around 10 billion euro, and just under 40% of that was classed as green finance. And in the district energy sector, we have lent or invested over 700 million euro across 18 countries. And the most recent pure district energy deal that we signed was in Mongolia for a project in the capital city, Ulaanbaatar. And in case you're keeping track, Ulaanbaatar is known as the coldest capital city in the world. So you can imagine they quite appreciate district heating there. So our objectives for the sector. I mentioned that we are a bit of a different bank, and we have a specific focus in certain areas. So in the countries we work in, there are some specific challenges. The infrastructure is old, has high investment needs, and there's also a need for tariff and regulatory reform to improve performance. So in addition to making loans and receiving those funds back with interest, we also want to see positive reforms made in the sector. So we also do policy work to help encourage such reforms. We produce policy papers covering topics in the sector, and you can see images of these on the right. They may be of interest to participants, and I will share links to them at the end of my presentation, and they're completely free to download. Now, on to the main subject, business models in the sector. Now, Clara did an excellent job of outlining the three most common business models or ownership models in the sector. I'm going to go into a bit more detail with a special focus on the public-private or the hybrid models. Now, with thanks to our friends at Bloomberg New Energy Finance, the image shown here shows very common business models for the sector, and they range from the most public to the most private. Like I said, Clara covered this nicely, so I will focus more on the public or private models. One word on public, so if it's completely public, what's important to know is that all equity is held in public hands. Now, the EBRD, we work a lot with these sorts of organizations, and our objectives there are to try and embed more commercial principles into their operations, as well as their relationship with their public sector owner. So in the realm of public-private models, we dip our toe into the private space. There's what's known as the management contract model. In this sort of model, public ownership is retained, but a utility operator, an outside utility operator, is hired to operate and maintain the network. Some people also consider that a fully public special purpose vehicle, that's a separate organization that has been established to develop and operate a network, but maybe composed completely of public equity. They believe that this is also an example of a public-private model because it allows for easier sale of equity stakes or the eventual entire sale to a private partner. Moving along, we see joint venture special purpose vehicles. Here again, an organization is established to develop and operate the network, but ownership and control, it's shared there by the two joint venture parties, one of which is public and one of which is private. And in the concession model, which is the most common form of what we would call a PPP, public-private partnership, the project sponsor, which is a public entity, makes what's called a concession agreement with a utility operator to build, own, operate, and at a later date, transfer that system back to public ownership. These are typically long-term agreements, and the risk and returns are normally fully transferred to the utility operator. And finally, there is the fully private model where everything is owned and operated by the private sector. Now, my observation is that these are more common where regulation is light touch, what we would call a mature district energy market. This would be less common for models where network operation is involved. Most of the examples that I see are on the production or generation side, where a private operator may operate a plant like this and sell to a separate district heating network. Now, some things to note about these models. Now, state, they may choose to make public funds available in the form of a grant to any of the above models if it believes that this will fulfill their policy objectives. So there is no single business model for a project that utilizes or leverages state funding. And also, transfer of risk to the private sector may sound like a great opportunity. However, in most cases, this means higher financing costs than if a project had public ownership. And in case you would like an example of an applicable risk, the big one, most commonly associated with new distributed energy networks, is demand risk. Will there be enough customers demanding heating or cooling? Now, I can draw on the experience of the EBRD again, and this follows on nicely from the previous information about the different business models. So here's the approach that we take to financing or investment that's been done in the sector. So continuing with the left to right of the screen theme, loans or financing types and their suitability for the above models. Beginning in the fully public sphere, we provide sovereign or sovereign-backed loans. Now, this is lent to a national government, potentially on lent to a state-owned utility, or it can be lent to a municipality, city, or the state-owned utility with an explicit guarantee from the state that should there be a default, this money will be paid back or guaranteed by the state. Typically, this is the cheapest form of finance that's available. Now, if we move towards the right, there are sub-sovereign loans. Now, these are still public loans to public entities, but they're normally lent directly to the company or the city, but they don't have this explicit sovereign guarantee. They're guaranteed at the city level, typically. So a bit more expensive, but still considered public financing. Now, corporate utility loans are also available. So an example of this may be a state-owned enterprise, which could be operated as a wholly state-owned SPV, but there's no guarantee required from a state actor backing because the company's revenues and assets are sufficient on their own to provide the right level of guarantee. And of course, there are private loans. When lent to an SPV that may be set up, a special purpose vehicle set up especially for a specific project, this is more like a project finance example. But money can also be lent to a project sponsor or backer or company that is setting up the project in the form of a corporate loan, where it's lent directly to that company. Now, in the utility sector, the regulatory environment has a great influence on business models and their respective financing options. So on that note, let's discuss regulation. Everybody get excited. But seriously, it is important. It's also important to state that there's no one-size-fits-all regulatory model or a recommended model for how to regulate your sector. It's all very dependent on a specific country's circumstances or objectives. So in my experience, regulatory models can range from burdensome or bureaucratic models to the light touch, what are called unregulated models, where there are no rules regarding price regulation. So-called unregulated systems, even they still include a certain amount of regulation. This could be the most basic form, dispute resolution mechanism. In some countries, this is called an ombudsman or ombudsperson, or some oversight perhaps by a competition authority to ensure that consumers have a right to disconnect from networks. Unfortunately, it's been observed that in some situations, the overly prescriptive form of regulation or bureaucratic one can be used as a cover opportunity for corruption, or it can be used for political aims, possibly to keep tariffs artificially low. There's more on this later. But whatever form, this isn't the only two, of course, whatever form is selected will impact on the likelihood of private sector participation in that sector, in the distributed energy sector. Now, national governments, some may choose to enact an overarching national law specific to the district energy sector, or this may be covered or rest within wider energy sector legislation. And regulation, it may also be necessary to ensure that the district energy sector is properly contributing to national objectives governing renewable energy or CO2 reduction. But again, there's an alternative. Governments may choose not to make explicit rules or set targets for the sector, but they could leave this to be accomplished indirectly if, for instance, they have a carbon pricing or a taxation regime in place for fossil fuels. Now, ideally, a country's approach to sector regulation, it needs to strike the correct balance between consumer rights, the need for operators to cover their costs and make a reasonable profit, and importantly, incentivize investment in the sector. Now, I'll describe a concept that may seem strange at first, and that's how regulation can act as an incentive for the sector. So there is a perception that in order to increase the uptake of district energy in some less mature markets, specific regulation of the sector can act as an incentive. It is believed that this will make consumers more likely to accept this service if there are legal protections for them, and this will create certainty for potential operators. So there's some truth to this, but I keep saying it is very country or market specific. In the absence of explicit regulation, consumers may perceive that they are paying more than they should. And this is an issue in less mature district energy markets, where there's not a lot of examples for them to draw upon. I believe that the idea that regulation is needed, that this is more of a case where there is a competitive retail market for domestic natural gas supply and a high penetration of individual gas boilers. Call it cultural, because these consumers, they may be used to having the ability to switch energy supplier and receive different prices potentially. So again, they need reassurance that they are not overpaying for a service that they perceive they cannot disconnect from. Another more explicit regulatory incentive for district energy is related to local planning or construction rules and regs. So permission to build can include obligations for new buildings to connect to any nearby district energy networks. Some places go a step further, and they designate entire city districts as, say, district heating zones, meaning that district heating connection is mandatory within that area. Please note that if, in order to go with this strong-handed form of regulation, there has to be a very strong public acceptance or support for district heating services. So in these zones, the rules, they would apply to new buildings and existing buildings that are undergoing major renovation. And this is also one way to overcome demand risk that exists in places with adverse conditions, such as a high penetration of individual heating solutions. Now, also, green building standards, they also offer another opportunity. And I can give a good example from Estonia. So here, the heating source, it's considered in the classification of how green a building is for planning or building permission purposes. Now, the score is given to fuels used for building heating in calculating a building's green or net zero carbon ranking. A better score is given to a building with district heating connection. And this means that investment in other areas, such as additional insulation, can be reduced in order to meet the necessary score to achieve the thresholds required to meet either permission requirements for building or for classing it as a green building. This gives a strong incentive for developers there to connect new buildings to district heating networks. So further important and interlinked topics are pricing or tariff setting for district energy services and how to take account of competition from alternative heating sources. So there's much that can be said on how to set tariffs, but that's not really the purpose of today's presentation, so I'll try to stick to some overall principles. And if you would like more detail or have a specific query, please don't hesitate to ask in the Q&A. So a relatively straightforward approach is the two-part tariff. Very well understood. There's a variable part, which is based on consumption, and the fixed part, which is a flat rate. The fixed portion is relatively straightforward. It applies primarily to infrastructure such as the network, what we call natural monopoly assets, much like in the electricity sector, gas sector, and water sector, network infrastructure there. A somewhat uniform approach has emerged in regulated markets. This is known as the regulated asset base model. Basically, objective here is that to cover the cost of the upkeep and necessary investments in the assets that get heat to your door, if heat used the front door. So there is much more creativity involved with setting the variable price, which is intended to cover the OPEX, or the operating expenditure and fuel costs. So the methodologies, they can be technology specific. They can utilize formula linked to the price of fuels, such as natural gas. They can use another method called the virtual heat-only boiler method. Again, ask me later if you want to know more. And in some very mature markets, there are competitive auctions that take place in larger systems where there are multiple heat providers available to sell heat to fairly large networks. Now, regulators in these areas, they also set targets for efficiency to drive improvements, but try to balance this against investment costs required. So in the absence of regulation, district energy operators, they're free to set their own tariffs. But in the interest of customer relations, transparency in tariff setting is very well advised. Also, a reasonable approach regarding disconnections should also be followed, and contracts should not be overly restrictive. Well, in my opinion, there's another inferior method of tariff setting or price cap, which is a somewhat arbitrary price cap, which can be set by government or a government minister. Now, this method of tariff setting usually doesn't take account of actual costs, let alone future investment needs for the sector. Sometimes it's less overt, it's not an explicit statement, but a state regulator may make it all but impossible to increase tariffs or include investment. So in some cases here we see subsidies are promised to utility companies to compensate for the shortfalls, for the difference in cost versus revenue. But this is also problematic, which I'll further explain. And in this model, private sector participation, it can be difficult. So the most common form of financing you would see here is sovereign or sub-sovereign financing, or even direct government budget transfers to fund projects or costs. And so in the absence of regulation, healthy competition, it can do the job of a regulator, and it can negate the need for price regulation in the sector, particularly in the heating sector, by setting a natural ceiling on prices. Now, healthy is the key word here, because competition against subsidized natural gas or electricity, this can distort things, and it can give consumers the wrong signal about the costs of district energy services. Some specific consideration around state funding, the role of subsidies. Now, state funding may be considered a bad word in some circles. However, in a less mature district energy market, it may be necessary to help establish the sector. The same is applicable if there's adverse project conditions, such as lower energy density. So a project may achieve policy aims, but it may have a poor internal rate of return. And in some systems, in their early stages, they'll experience low early stage tariff revenue. And they may need to make use of internal funds or a grant potentially available from government to make an equity or equity-like investment in their system that can fund revenue gaps resulting from the low load in the early initial years of operation. And it's important to note, this is intended to cover a short period of time, say 5 years, and it's not meant to be open-ended, as you expect costs to be spread more evenly as more connections are added to the network. And again, in these early markets, the use of state funds can also de-risk those first projects and attract private sector participation to subsequent projects. An implicit form of public subsidy or support is available by ensuring that all public buildings in the vicinity of a network are connected. And this helps to create anchor loads for a system, particularly a new system. And as mentioned previously, a political price cap alongside open-ended subsidy by the state to public companies is not sustainable. If tariffs are being set below costs for social reasons, a targeted subsidy for low-income groups rather than a blanket subsidy for the entire population is considered much more effective. So I've been describing some overarching principles can apply to projects, but now let me share a case study of a project we supported in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in which the client took an innovative approach. Now, incidentally, this project is also another great example of the partnership between UN Environment's District Energy and Cities Initiative and the EBRD. So we were very happy to collaborate with the initiative, and they kindly supported ourselves and the client with funds to help develop feasibility studies prior to signing the project loan agreement that were key to getting the project over the line. So the project took place in Banja Luka, which is the second biggest city in Bosnia. And previously, Banja Luka, their district heating system, it was almost completely based upon heavy polluting fuel oil. So air quality was a big issue as a result of this, as was the cost of oil and the financial sustainability of operations. So something needed to be done, and it was well known that sustainable biomass supplies were available in the region. So for this project, we lent €8 million to the city of Banja Luka, and this allowed the city to contribute equity to a new private joint venture for district heating services in the city, joint venture SPV. So previously, all district heating services have been provided by the loss-making city-owned company. The new company built the new 49 megawatt biomass boiler and operates and maintains networks in the city under a long-term concession agreement. So today, over 95% of heat supply now comes from renewable sources. A new tariff was put in place, which included cost recovery. This was certainly aided by the lower price of biomass relative to oil. And because it's an EBRD project, the company had to and has adhered to our environmental and social rules. Now, I'll finish up the last part of the presentation with some specific points on district cooling. Now, there is much overlap between district cooling and district heating, the principles, but I can pull out some of the specific considerations for district cooling networks. So there are fewer legacy systems in this area, and most financing requirements come up for new networks that were linked to new large-scale developments. Now, the most common approach that's seen in the Middle East, which is the biggest district cooling market, is that district cooling services are provided by a specific district cooling operator based on a long-term concession agreement. Now, district cooling, it's less likely to have specific regulation governing tariffs, and this lack of regulation, it may put a greater onus on developers. They need to ensure that the concession agreement they make with an operator is robust and it has a defined approach to tariff setting and termination rights if there are breaches of that. Now, I mentioned most district cooling networks, they're built as part of a large-scale development. And district cooling project sponsors or initiators, they tend to be those real estate developers. There are some exceptions, of course. Some city-level networks are found in EU or in North American cities, which take a similar approach to district heating. In fact, owned or operated by district heating companies. But this is less common in terms of the pipeline of new projects. So let's take a look at some of the common business models used by developers. The first would be an in-house approach. Here, the developer chooses to fund and retain control over the district cooling network in their development, but they're also retaining risk. So some reasons this may be more likely that they have some in-house utility management expertise. However, they can also hire a management contractor to operate and maintain the network for them while they still retain ownership and control. and the cost may be rolled into the overall development cost. So it's less likely to be financed separately. But this doesn't stop them from potentially selling or agreeing to a concession at a later date. Second common approach is the joint venture SPV, possibly familiar by now, but a partnership between the developer and experienced district cooling operator is established in a newly established company. Risk, cost, and control are shared, but the expectation here is the partner will bring their operational expertise. So both parties are expected to contribute equity, but it could also be possible for the SPV to borrow or raise financing specific for the project. And this is up to a certain percentage of project cost. Or the parties could take corporate loans and contribute more equity. Now, the third model is the full concession. And in my opinion, this is the most straightforward. Almost all risk and cost is transferred, and an experienced district cooling operator agrees to build, own, operate, and eventually transfer the infrastructure back to the developer at a future date. So this could use a project finance model. The district cooling operator could use their own funds or a corporate loan to support construction, or third parties looking for return on equity. They may also choose to invest in such a system. Now, a district cooling case study follows nicely on from these district cooling specific points. The EBRD, we supported construction of the district heating and cooling network in Amman for the new Abdali development. In this project, our client was a joint venture SPV that was actually a bit of a hybrid between the in-house model and the joint venture model, as one partner was the overall project developer and the other was the parent developer company. Anyhow, for this project, we lent around 26 million euro to finance construction of the main plant and thermal store, which had a total EPC value of around 42 million euro. So the remaining project costs were met with sponsor equity. And there was also a large cost associated with network installation, but this was built by the developers in the early stages of the project. So in addition to the interesting model, this was an exciting project that contained some cool technical innovations, such as the largest thermal store in the Middle East at the time of construction, and the use of air-cooled condensers on a large-scale ammonia installation. Oh, and at the time, it was also the first district cooling network in Jordan, I believe still the only. Ooh, well, now we did cover a lot of ground, so thanks for staying and lasting this long. So in conclusion, we all agree that district energy is great, and it's probably the best way to utilize more local, renewable, and waste heat sources in our energy systems. But there's some key considerations. So the business model can have a large influence on a project's perceived risk and its funding cost. Regulation, it can act as an incentive, particularly in those less mature district energy markets. And tariffs, irrespective of who's setting them, private or a regulated market, they must be transparent and they must account for or encourage investment. And subsidies or grant funding, they're a good tool that can revitalize and rehabilitate legacy infrastructure or facilitate a new sector. And in an unregulated market, you need to give consumers comfort that there is somebody there who will support them in the event of a dispute with the operator. So, as emphasized, no single model is applicable everywhere. And well, thanks again, like I said, for lasting this long. And you'll see on this slide, which I assume will be shared with you after, some links to those policy papers. And I encourage you to have a look at them, and I hope you find them useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you, for the very interesting and thorough presentations. Now it's time for the Q&A session, and we received several questions, and it seems from our system here that we continuously receiving the questions. We'll do our best to answer as many as possible. So at the moment, I would like to start with those three questions that we received. The first one is for you, Craig, and the question is, could you share key recommendations when developing a price cap when there has been no prior district energy market?
Yes, certainly. So I would say that it's extremely important in this case to look at the alternative fuel sources available in that market. So consumers will automatically benchmark themselves against what their peers or what they remember paying for such a service. So of course you can't sell your services at a loss for an extended period of time. So you need to ensure that your model is competitive. But you also need to consider and ensure that your customer base understands that the price that they're paying for a unit of heat energy has built in almost or all of the cost for maintenance or replacement or general upkeep of the system that they would have had to maintain themselves. So comparing it to a heat-only boiler, many consumers, they might mistakenly compare the price of a district heating service to the price of a single unit of natural gas, but this doesn't account for the price of that boiler in their home or apartment, which they may not remember, but at one time they paid a considerable amount of money for, or they are due to pay a considerable amount of money for when it is going to be replaced. And please bear in mind that model I described for a new system where costs are high at first, but tariff revenue is low, and the possible injection of equity to smooth over those first years.
Thank you very much, Craig, for your response. The next question is, I think it's for Clara. So, Clara, the question is it best to have a private-public partnership or a private partnership to develop district energy systems?
Thank you, Adis, for forwarding the question, and thank you for the question. Yeah, as I mentioned, I don't think there's a better model than other. I think it very much depends on the circumstance. I think this is something that Greg also highlighted at the very end of his presentation. Yeah, what I would definitely highlight is the fact that no matter what the model adopted is finally, so what the mechanism is, it is very important to make sure that the public authorities, or at least some regulatory framework, is ensuring that the social and the environmental requirements are met in the development of district energy. That can when I talk about social requirements, I talk about, or I mean, energy access, energy poverty alleviation if possible. And when I talk about environmental, I mean CO2, PM reduction, or any kind of other environmental impact that could be either avoided or improved. This can be done through tendering process or regulation mechanisms, as Greg very nicely described. This could be like a tariff control or a price cap. But again, it will depend very much on the circumstance and the framework conditions. If there has been a preliminary network, pre-existing network or not, what are the overall costs of developing the infrastructure, also of the operation and maintenance, what is the equity capacity of the different stakeholders, who are the different stakeholders, what are the profiles, is it public, private, what are the intentions, what is the level of debt, the return on investment. There's so many things that need to be considered to properly define the best model that I think I wouldn't be able to say, okay, PPP or private model. I think it very much depends on the circumstance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Clara, for your response. The next question is for you, Craig, and the question is, what trade structure have you experienced to be most successful in the various district energy projects you have been involved in?
Oh, that's a good question. Unfortunately, I see a lot of bad structures, but it's good to focus on the positive. So I think a structure should be simple enough that it can be well understood by members of the public, but it should also provide an adequate challenge to the sector, so for them to improve and drive efficiencies. So there is a certain kind of model, a virtual boiler model that I've seen in some countries. Actually, it's it's been used in the Baltic states, the 3 former Soviet republics, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And there is in most of these countries, there's a fairly good and fairly liquid biomass market, and biomass boilers play a relatively large part in the sector. So I believe in at least 2 of the countries, they apply a price cap that will be based upon what it would cost to generate the equivalent amount of heat in, for instance, a heat-only biomass boiler. So that's taken as a form of benchmark. And in this type of approach, it works there because they're widely available and it's commonplace. That can be understood. And it's something that district energy operators, it should drive them to improve efficiencies, but it's something that it's not so difficult that they can't beat that. And it doesn't require constant reevaluation. Such a model shouldn't require evaluation every few months or so. And it's, again, well understood. So I believe that this is a good model. I hope I've described it well. There's nuances in each country, but the overarching principle is you are comparing it to another form of technology and the cost of generating that heat in that technology.
Thank you, Craig. We're close to the deadline, but I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. We received a question that the attendee didn't mention who the question is for, so I'm just going to say it and just unmute to respond. And the question is, are existing business models or case studies applicable for small city projects and SME developers? So, any response?
I can say something, and maybe Clara wants to jump in.
Yeah, then let's start with you, Craig.
I guess, I mean, it all depends on how small of a city you're talking about. Of course, the more people in general, the greater population, the greater scale, normally there's a chance to lower your costs associated with that. But I mean, that's only an obstacle up to a point. I think that any sufficient amount of scale is good for development of a new district energy network. So I certainly think that these models are applicable to a small city. I don't know what the person who asked the question had in mind when they were saying small, but I assume they're not referring to a tiny village.
I would complement that by Greg's answer by saying I think a critical point is the density of the location. So in order to make the project viable, the district energy project viable, and you need to have a minimum amount of density and a minimum amount of connection. So I think as long as those 2 are ensured, I think the size of the city, I mean, the very moment we call it a city, I'm assuming it's not that small. I think it would be, it could be studied to assess the viability of the potential of the technology in that area. That's the only 2 parameters, density and connectivity, that I would add to Greg's answer.
Thank you, Clara and Craig. Our last question is for Craig. And the question, Craig, is why is there less need for regulation for district cooling? Are there examples of public funded DC projects?
I don't think I would say that there's less need for regulation of district cooling. It seems to be the way the sector has developed. So what I was describing about the developer-led model, where you may have a parcel of land or an area that is to be regenerated, for instance, and it's being led by a private sector developer who has a certain plan for that area and is planning to incorporate utility services into their plan. That tends to lend itself more to the private model, and the provision of cooling actually has been almost an afterthought I would say, in some regulators' minds, because traditionally this has been hidden in electricity bills. in individual cooling solutions. But the role of public sector, it's not absent. So there are examples of citywide district cooling networks. Certainly in the Scandinavian countries, I'm aware of such networks in Stockholm, in Helsinki, in Copenhagen, some of the usual suspects, Gothenburg as well. I don't know the level of public involvement there was in those specific networks, but I know that the district heating networks had public involvement, and they may have since transferred to private sector-led models. Whether district cooling came in at the public time or in the private time, I'm not sure. But at that citywide scale, where you may have, say, a number of already existing buildings that have large cooling demand loads, I can see the potential for provision of cooling to those buildings and potential desire for regulation of that, similar to that in the district heating model. The lack of it, I would say, is more a symptom of the way cooling has been treated or perceived, and by this developer-led model of district cooling systems.
Thank you very much, Craig, for your response.
Adis, may I add something before we close?
Of course.
I just want to stress again that this is part of the fifth training module that we've developed for the GF6 as part of the training for district energy in cities initiative, and we will soon upload all of the training modules in the knowledge management system hosted in the C2E2 website in collaboration with UNEP. So if you want more information, some follow-up complementary information of what we just shared, we will let you know as soon as this is uploaded so you can access this information as part of the GF6 deliverables. Thank you very much.
And thank you for the detailed responses to the questions. So, ladies and gentlemen, finally we come to the end of the webinar. It's been more than 1 hour than we anticipate that the webinar will last. I would like to say thanks to the panelists for the informative and interesting presentations, and of course to the audience for their active participation. We hope the presentations will be beneficial for all stakeholders involved in energy efficiency and district energy. Thank you for your attention, and wish you a good day or night from Copenhagen.